Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome on a beautiful, warm, kind of spring-like afternoon. It's great to see Ream Library as full as it is, even on a nice day like today. My name is Tom Laney. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center sponsors and supports lectures, conferences, workshops, classroom visits, like one today in Professor Pochet's class, and other special programs that foster conversation or dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. You can find our upcoming schedule and our programs and recordings of events like today's online on our website at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. Today's lecture is one of the Deitchman Family Lectures on Religion and Modernity, and I'm grateful to John Deitchman of the class of 1970 and his family for their generous support that makes it possible. It's a really poignant time, I'd say, to be discussing resistance to fascism as we face threats from Russia's war in Ukraine and the rise of autocracy and extreme nationalism around the world. Our guest speaker, Professor Brenna Moore, has written a fascinating account of an international network of Catholic historians, theologians, poets, and activists who formed spiritual friendships and practiced resistance to European xenophobia and nationalism, anti-racist activism in the United States, and solidarity with Algerian Muslims during the early 20th century. Her book, published in 2021, is called Kindred Spirits, Friendship and Resistance at the Edges of Modern Catholicism. I've known Brenna for a long time. We've had the privilege of being friends. She's professor of theology at Fordham University in New York, a specialist in the area of modern Christianity with a focus on Catholic intellectual and cultural history in Europe. She's particularly interested in questions related to women, gender, and religion, mysticism and spirituality, a movement in theology known as ressourcement, and various Catholic responses to modernity. Professor Moore is currently serving as president of the American Catholic Historical Association. She's published on figures like the novelist Léon Bloy, the mystic and poet Raïssa Maritain, and her husband, the philosopher Jacques Maritain, and the Jesuit historians of spirituality, Henri de Lubac and Michel de Certeau. She's author of Sacred Dread, Raïssa Maritain and the Allure of Suffering and the French Catholic Revival, 1905 to 1944. And she's co-editor with Mary Dunn of the volume Religious Intimacies, Intersubjectivity in the Modern Christian West. She's also published, maybe of a special interest, maybe to some people here, more than just as the others are to me, on the religious imagination of artists like Sinead O'Connor and Beyonce, and on exhibits at the Met. So please join me in welcoming Brenna Moore.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Tom, for the lovely introduction. It's truly a pleasure to be here at Holy Cross this afternoon and to present the Deitchman Family Lecture on Religion and Modernity. So I really think of Holy Cross as one of kind of the epicenters for thinking about the internal diversity and richness of Catholic thought, spirituality, and practice. I have in mind the scholarship of friends and colleagues like Matthew Schmalz in the Religious Studies Department, Justin Pochet in History, and of course Tom Landy here at the Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, and many more. And on a personal note, I was here many years ago when I was maybe 15, 20 years ago for a wedding of some very close friends who were Holy Cross alum, and I spent the weekend with all of their friends who also did their undergrad here, and that very much they knew how to have a good time, to put it mildly. So Holy Cross really seems like a place where a lot of fun and also serious thinking about religion come together. So I'm a fan and honored to be back on this special campus. So my lecture is entitled Fragments of Friendship, Spiritual Undercurrents of the Global Catholic Resistance to Fascism. The story of this project began, though, really, to be honest, when I finally kind of overcame my hesitancy or really embarrassment about taking seriously friendship as an academic category of analysis. So I came into this field as a scholar of 20th century French Catholicism, which I know sounds very random, but I was drawn into the study of the creative thinkers who help lay the foundations for the massive shifts that took place in theology and spirituality that culminated in what was called Vatican II, that took place in the 60s. Some of you may know about that. Some of you maybe will learn about it later when you have to do more religious studies classes. But this was when Pope John the 23rd ended the church's alleged war with modernity. I was especially interested in the Catholics from the 30s, 40s, and 50s who lived through the Holocaust and reckoned more honestly with it, and those who helped set the stage for new, more humane ways for Catholics to think about religious and cultural difference. But because Catholic thought tends to be so male and so clerical, I was interested in uncovering the understudied contributions of women. And so students in this audience who are with us and who might be thinking in the future while you're at Holy Cross that you might do your own independent research someday for your senior thesis or an independent study, that you maybe already know that when you want to kind of go beyond established canons of knowledge, you have to unearth new stories in the field. You got to look for overlooked voices, and this means doing archival work or doing ethnographic work. And this, I think, is the super fun stuff of academic work, creating new knowledge. That means kind of traveling, talking with the communities you're studying, or meeting archivists, librarians, digging through dusty boxes, folders, looking at pictures, and really kind of reclaiming the importance to human experiences that have been just dismissed. We see this kind of discarded, dusty stuff as critical in our shared search for a more inclusive understanding of human thought and expression. So it was in doing that kind of work a long time ago when I first discovered a woman named Raissa Maritain, who is a mystical writer, poet, and the wife of a famous Catholic philosopher, Jacques Maritain. They were both from France, and they were both involved in the resistance to anti-Semitism and fascism. And when they fled Europe to the United States as exiles in 1939, they helped Jewish colleagues safely get out of Europe to New York. And it was in going through the archival material of Raissa stuff, her boxes and stuff, that it became immediately clear to me that friendship was by far the most important thing in their lives. So these are just some things I found in the archives. This is a picture in France of her recreated study, and it just struck me right away that these photos, I know you can't see these in detail, but it's pictures of her friends kind of intermingled with photos and portraits of saints, of priests, of spiritual directors, and sort of an inter kind of mingled collage of her actual real friends and other holy figures in her life. Her memoir was called Les Grandes Amitiés, and those who are taking French in high school or here know that means the Great Friendships, where she said, my life explains my friendships explain my life. And also, when I looked through all of her correspondence, and Jacques too, I would open up folders and letters, and sometimes little religious medallions and pictures, little religious material objects would kind of fall out. So all the kind of letters exchanged through with their friends had a kind of tactile spirituality to them, without a doubt, okay? I also met, in the course of my research, elderly people for whom the Maritains were not just history, but they were still living memory. So I would meet people who knew them, and they would often show me, or even if I was really lucky, give me things that belonged to the Maritains, a portrait with Jacques' signature. This is a check that Raissa wrote, her funeral card, but they would hand them to me kind of as if they were handing me, really sacred objects that really did seem for these people to contain something of the grace of the Maritains who are no longer with us, who are no longer with them. Yet, despite the prominent presence of friendship, this was like the key to their whole world. I shied away from it as an academic topic for my first book because, here I was a woman writing on a woman. Is, friendship kind of stereotypically feminine? Today, friendship, as my friend, religion scholar Constance Fury writes, contains the whiff of something apolitical. There's nothing wrong with friendship. Nobody would say there's nothing wrong with it, but it's kind of like quaint. Indeed, the binaries that structure modernity, masculine, feminine, public, private, a religion, secular, rational, emotional, would, I think, steer our interpretation of friendship as belonging properly to the private realm, the warm sphere of emotion, religion, and women. And I really didn't want to be pigeonholed that way, and I didn't want her to be pigeonholed that way, most of all. So for my first project on Raisa Maritain, I focused on, her life, but in the context to other things that were more recognizably like political: fascism, anti-Semitism, Judaism. And also this was important to me because I knew that her political context, like the Holocaust, the rise of fascism, anti-Semitism, culminated with the state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children by the Nazi regime and collaborators. And I really feel that an analysis of friendship in such a violent context would really play into something troubling in our popular imagination in the US. So I think movies like The Secret Life of Bees and even The Green Mile offer a seemingly irresistible narrative that interpersonal friendships within systems of oppression and violence are the sole, purest ways to mitigate violence in our world, which is a deeply, deeply pernicious idea. And indeed, to consider the larger social, political meanings of spiritual friendship among women, particularly in a violent context, is to really invite so many problems. So yeah, I set it aside. But then, when you kind of go through academic life, you kind of like get a little more confident. I got tenure, and I thought, you know what? Like, screw it. I don't care. I want to just write about this friendship thing and just figure it out and then move on to other things. But I can't really let this go because I know this was the most important thing. And so I dug a little deeper, went kind of further into the archives of this period, into their archives, and I learned really immediately that the Maritains were simply a little portal into a vast international network in this period from the 30s to the 60s, where what I call spiritual friendship was absolutely central. So I began to learn about other Catholic men and women who had connections to Jacques and Raisa Maritain, but they had roots and lives all over the world, places like Harlem, New York, Cairo, Egypt, Uruguay, even Jamaica. And they weren't exactly an isolated group of friends all over the world, but some of them were actually, but instead, spiritual friendship was a shared worldview and a practice central to a global and international community that aimed to combat anti-Semitism, white bigotry, and even in some cases, colonialism. And attending to it, I saw really gets at what I call the inner life of an incredibly creative period in Catholicism, pointing us to the emotions that underlie a really unique moment in political modernity. Friendship was, at one hand, a corridor to the sacred. It was a way of communing, really, really with God. Religiously meaningful friendships took place not only just face-to-face, but also with the remembered dead, those held in non-ordinary realms of consciousness like memory, imagination. Friends often reach for metaphors of fire to talk about their friends. Friends kindle the flame of one another's spirit and so forth. And friendship, I came to see, was also sensed to counter the different kind of modes of human belonging that were gaining ascendancy in the far right in this period, including nationalism on the one hand and the prioritization of the nuclear family on the other. So the language of friendship, and you can see some of the French, and there's some Spanish and the English translation. The language of friendship was the central metaphor for Catholic activist organizations in this period, in the years before Vatican II. So the first two organizations, the Friends of Foreign Workers, Friends of People, were found in France. One was a newspaper, one was an organization meant to combat xenophobia and welcome refugees. The other were two Jewish Christian friendship organizations founded in Lyon and Paris, they were part of the underground resistance to Nazism and the protection of the Jewish community. There was a worker rights organization in Mexico, an academic organization dedicated to the study of one of these French scholars in Uruguay. And then this is an image from this kind of interracial experimental community in Harlem called the Friendship House. And when I dig into these a little bit further in the course of my talk, you'll hear kind of the people associated with this were all over the world. But often these friends met in Paris, okay? But Paris was a city that welcomed intellectuals from all points of the globe in the 1920s and 30s, many of whom were fleeing persecution in their own countries. So by the mid-1920s, France received more immigrants than any other country in the industrialized world. In 1930, 3 million foreigners resided in France. Langston Hughes put it that interwar Paris was packed with what he called the seeking wandering ones from all over the world. It was, of course, also the beating heart of France's colonial empire and even the resistance movements to French colonialism itself. But let me just say at the outset that you'll see that I find in this kind of emotional underworld resources, I think, that point us to a Catholic tradition that's a little bit of a different kind of Catholic politics than we tend to see in kind of the contemporary U.S., even what I call kind of a counter history that comes from a different archive that shows Catholic love looking a little bit differently than we tend to think about. And it was meant to oppose, at least kind of quietly, narrower, more homogenous bonds based on, family and nationalism. But I also want to say, just right at the outset, before you think I'm kind of romanticizing this movement, that it didn't always go the way that they aimed to. These people didn't always live up to these ideals they set for themselves. There were failures, blind spots, but despite this shortcoming, I think these resources may be of interest for anyone here in the room for whom, this is the way I kind of think about it, for whom Catholicism in some way still kind of stubbornly means something, whether it's like practicing Catholic, lapsed Catholic, marginal Catholic, or you're secular or come from other faiths, but you're getting your education at the Catholic school and you just want like a richer sense of that tradition. But first, let me just show you a little bit of this world. So to talk about the fascism part. So the great historian of the French resistance, Francois Benderita, wrote of the French Catholics in 1940. He said, almost all the faithful lived in complete docility towards a very structured and hierarchical church. Authority reigned supreme. The first virtue of the Christian was obedience. Okay, so this is like a Catholicism of obedience. And the hierarchy in 20th century Europe, for the most part, historically kind of trusted regimes in Europe as long as they were either Catholic or promised not to explicitly target Catholics. And this meant, like in the 30s and the 40s, a kind of coziness or at least compliance with authoritarian leaders, first Franco in Spain, and then with regimes who collaborated with the Nazis, like the Vichy regime in France. And the faithful kind of trusted a church that never officially called for resistance, that generated among Catholics a widespread compliance with authoritarian leaders all over the world that was kind of smoothed over by the spirituality of obedience. So those Catholics that did resist fascism did so without any instructions from on high, from the bishops or anything. It came from civil society. It came from below. It included priests and nuns, but mostly I'm going to be talking about lay people. Lay people who sensed the dangers and were really not afraid of transgression. But this was really a minority phenomenon from start to finish, who kind of had to feel their way around the resistance. And the first people I'm going to talk about is this Chilean poet, Gabriela Mistral, and this is her friendship with Jacques Maritain, the guy in one of the first slides. She was friends of Theresa and Jacques Maritain. Gabriela Mistral was from Chile, who was living in Paris for a brief period. She was anointed the spiritual queen of Latin America when she won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1947. She was a teacher of Pablo Neruda, a name that might be familiar to some of you. She was also a Franciscan oblate and a lay member of the Order of St. Francis. So her friendship with the Maritains was key to the globalization of the emerging Catholic anti-fascist movements of the 30s, particularly getting kind of this idea that Catholics could be opposed to fascism and could sanction democracy and human dignity. She was central to getting that idea spread to from the French to the Spanish-speaking world, to Spain, also Latin America, Chile, Argentina. They helped together break apart the old kind of alliance between the colonial church and the politics of the far right. Mistral had moved from South America to Spain as a writer and someone who worked on international cooperation, but she fled for Paris in 1933 in the midst of the far-right nationalism under Franco. And by the 1920s, there were 15,000 people from Latin America living in Paris. And Mistral and Maritain kind of were the epicenter of the Spanish and French-seeking activist intellectual organizations that were writing on the dangers of fascism very early on and were kind of among the first Catholic intellectuals to do so. Mistral helped get his stuff translated into Spanish, physically brought a lot of his writings to Spain, and got a lot of the Spanish speakers and French speakers together. She also introduced Jacques Maritain to the would-be president of Chile, Eduardo Frei, he went on to found the Chilean Democratic Party, and in Chile, I would say Jacques Maritain's ideas remain really, really influential. But the issue was for the people in Latin America warding off fascism from Europe from coming to the global south, okay? But underneath all of this anti-fascist work, the intimacies of friendship were fueling the entire thing. Mistral wrote to a friend in Chile about the Maritains. These souls are capable as serving as extraordinary guides. It is in their home, the house of the Maritains, where my soul is most full. And just like the little bits of holy cloth, tooth, and bone that Christians have always gathered from saints, from people deemed holy, it was photographs of special friends that were the sacred objects in this shared world. So Eduardo Frei begged Gabriela Mistral for a signed photo of herself, which she sent to him, begged Jacques for photos, and he put them up in his office, right next to a cross, kind of like what we saw in her study. And another friend wrote to Mistral herself from France that said, I want your picture because it's by the sight of your face. I am guided to God. And Mistral said, whenever I write, my friends, alive or dead, present, absent, come to me. They don't surround me, but they press in on me. They contain me. Spiritual friendship included the internalization of the absent, the missing, the far away during the war. But then it became really increasingly very dangerous for outspoken critics of fascism in other countries too. So after France succumbed to the Nazi collaborationist regime of Vichy in 1940, the Maritains fled in exile to North America. Gabriela Mistral left for Brazil. And there was a small community of Catholics, not just who stayed, many Catholics stayed in France, but who participated in the resistance. And spiritual friendship remained crucial here too, during the war itself, rather than just the rise of fascism. So this is a picture of a woman who I really came to love in the course of my study. Her name is Marie Magdalene Davy. She's a scholar of medieval mysticism, but she was very, very active in the underground network helping Jews safely get out of Europe. She was active in Catholic student groups and in the activist network Amitié Chrétienne, so Christian friendship. And she talked a lot about kind of hiding the underground kind of clandestine paperwork in a Catholic chapel because people didn't really suspect the Catholic chapels as kind of an epicenter for resistance. And I never found, this is the file of all of her resistance material from her archive, and I never found the paperwork, that she referred to, that they talked about that they did. But just to give you an example of the kind of paperwork the underground resistance would have done, this is an identity card that is currently located at one of the Holocaust museums at Seton Hall University. And up above, you'll see this is a Jewish identity card of a young French boy who is, I think, 11 years old. And all Jews in France had to have this yellow identity card with the person facing side, the name, and clearly marking, Jews from non-Jewish citizens or refugees in France. But one of the kind of the paperwork, that the underground resistance did, like the people in Amitié Chrétienne, people like Davy, would make these fake identity cards. So this is the same boy with a French name, with the red, non-Christian French citizenship card, with a new address, and the underground resistance movement made this for him. And, there was talk of, getting literally laminators, figuring out how to make this, no one instructing from on high, people winging it. And that this successfully worked, and he hid in the farm of a Protestant family and survived the Holocaust. And I had the fortune of meeting this man who's now in his 90s. I met him at Seton Hall, which is an extraordinary experience. So this is just the kind of thing that the resistance was doing, that Davy perhaps was doing, but certainly the Amitié Chrétienne group was doing. And let me just see. And when Davy was doing this work, friendship was absolutely crucial for her, but in kind of a different way. So notice that first picture, she was all by herself laying there. Usually she's smoking a cigarette. This is another picture when she's old, surrounded just by books. She was really kind of a loner, a solitary figure, the scholar of mysticism. But when she talks about friendship, she talked about it differently. She talked about the inner bond that she felt with the medieval mystics and monks that she wrote about. So scholarship she kept up with in the war. So maybe, I know most of you are first-year students, so maybe you haven't had this experience here, but maybe in high school you did. Like if you're writing a paper on someone for so long, it really feels like they are real to you. You know, they kind of live with you in an inner sense. And so she said, with passion, I have my mystical theologians who are my friends, my family. They are so close to me, part of my daily life. They lived with me. And she talked about these mystical monks and theologians and writers as really helping her during the clandestine acts of resistance by helping keep her focus in a time that was otherwise very, very terrifying. She once had to do things. She hid in the basement of a bakery for 3 days. She was pursued by soldiers. And so she kind of talked about these monks as kind of her inner guides, her friends. And then after the war, she created this kind of an international utopian commune dedicated to post-war peace for students that was in memory of one of her friends that died in the war, Simone Weil, called Maison Simone Weil. Many of these Catholics, I would say, did see connections between, the violence, the rise of xenophobia, oppression that was happening in Europe, and then actually, I'm going to stretch a little, and what was happening in the U.S. at this time in the 1930s, 40s, around race. As one volunteer said it, the root of it all, anti-Semitism, fascism, anti-Negro, okay, this was the language of 1940, is hate. It takes a powerful kind of love to hold this back. And there were pathways of exchange between places like New York and Paris where people were talking about these connections, about different kinds of violence and oppression, different kinds of solidarity. And some of you may have heard, of there's many black writers who spent time in Paris before and after the war. James Baldwin, names that probably are familiar to many of you from high school. And James Baldwin said, "The years I lived in Paris did one thing for me. They released me from that particular terror, which was a real danger, visible in every American cop, boss, everybody." Okay, so Paris was like a relatively more open atmosphere before World War I and after for black writers and artists. But one that I want to talk about briefly is this poet of the Harlem Renaissance, Claude McKay, who spent time in Paris before the war and converted to Catholicism in 1940. And in Paris, he met with another woman, a French-speaking Catholic from Martinique, Paulette Nerdal, who was the first black student at the Sorbonne. And I think when we tend to think of sort of the black diaspora, black internationalism, we really don't think of France and of Paris, but I really think that the reason that was such a site of Catholic creativity is because it was so diverse. I think that that's why it's very understudied. But Paulette Nerdal created this journal called the Revue du Monde Noir, and it was dedicated to what she called forging international ties and bonds among the international black community, black people from the African diaspora in the United States who were in Paris at this time. And Claude McKay wrote poems in this book, and she had a kind of a salon, a study hall that she called a circle of friends. So again, even in this network too, kind of the friendship piece was really central. When Claude McKay When Claude McKay went back to the United States, he connected up with a very numerically small, I don't want to make this seem like this was what all Catholics were, a numerically small network of Catholics who were interested in questions of race and racial justice. He became kind of drawn into the American Catholic scene. And this is a letter that he exchanged with Dorothy Day. I know some of you in Justin's class have read Dorothy Day. And Dorothy Day's letters to Claude McKay have these little holy cards. And this is what I see like the coin of this international network. The letters to friends tucked with this little holy stuff. That was like the currency. And ultimately, he converted to kind of this sort of Catholicism in 1940. But one of the things that oh, wait, no, sorry. I'm missing something. Oh, no, I had it. I already showed it. One of the things that we see very much debated that Claude McKay, there we go, that Claude McKay debated, that was very much the subject of debate in the Friendship House newsletter, was the role of friendship for political change and solidarity. So McKay talked a lot about how enthusiastic white liberals were about friendship. Like if he was even walking down the street with a white person, people would say, oh, you must be best friends, like, yay, you're kind of the symbol of the kind of racially integrated future. And he really thought that could never really do anything to combat racial oppression in the United States, that friendship had to be the starting point for structural change, that you begin as friends, but then you work together on doing things like documenting housing discrimination, employment discrimination, and so forth. But there were white people in Friendship House that really thought friendship was the point, that you could get people together and they would, display picnics, interracial picnics and friendship, that was the end goal. And the more I came to read into this world, I really saw this as a major, major tension and kind of problem that was unresolved. And ultimately, this was one of the reasons that the Friendship House was an experiment that kind of eventually flopped, even though there were interesting political changes that took place thanks to the help of people who were involved. It was a short-lived experimental project. And now I'm just going to say, let's see. I'm good on time. I'm just going to say a few more kind of interpretive things about this network, things that I kind of came to realize about it, things I think about it, some of the implications. And so I'm done showing you the picture. So just back to my original slide. Okay, so the one thing, this issue about what is the role of friendship? Is that the goal, or is that just the starting place? And, so that was something. It's kind of like an interpersonal way of solving change. Black Catholics were very skeptical about that. The other thing, the more I came to know this network, right, and the friendships that sustained it, many other complexities surfaced. So I have to admit that when I first got into this world, I saw in this network's non-familial, non-conformist forms of love as very emancipatory, exciting. I was very compelled by the commitment in their lives to a kind of love much wider than the kind of Catholic heteronormative, the narrow, or a kind of love that was just focused on nuclear family alone. It was very refreshing and fun, I would say, to immerse myself in the pleasures of all of their friendships, their expansive loves that reached across the walls that separate women from women, men from men, men from women, native born from newcomer, descendants of white settlers from the descendants of black and brown enslaved people, Christian from non-Christian, and so forth. But this idealized love grew increasingly strange, even disturbing. Not that I still do feel that way about it, but there was other things that made this more complicated. I realized, for example, that while the kind of anti-family thrust of their lives, they dedicated their life to friends, not family. It sounds kind of radical, especially from maybe a feminist perspective. The rejection of family was not just a slogan. There were actual children, parents, siblings in this network whose lives I really learned about with some horror. So let's just say it would have been really amazing to be a friend in this friendship group, but it would have been kind of horrifying to be a child of any of these people. Gabriela Mistral raised a child that she had adopted from a family member who couldn't take care of him, but with her moves all around the world, she was kind of sustained by this friendship network, but her child was isolated, depressed, and lonely, and died by suicide as a teenager. Claude McKay had a daughter but never met her in person. He had nothing to do with his wife after she became pregnant in the United States and returned to Jamaica without him. So Dorothy Day's granddaughter, Kate Hennessy, wrote an unforgettable memoir called The World Will Be Saved by Beauty, which provides, quite frankly, an often heartbreaking glimpse at what it would have been like to be a child in a family where the most ardent love is directed towards friends. While there was much to admire in this community who had a really expansive understanding of spiritual friendship, there's no way, I don't think, to disentangle one purely emancipatory thread out of the complex tangle of their lives. It was courageous, it was countercultural, it was pluralistic, compassionate, but sometimes it held within it too much fantasy about the possible, and it caused pain for families. It also was very erotically charged. It was sensual world, passionate love expressed, but it was still, for the most part, pretty silent on actual sex. Like, sex was actually, for the most part, a taboo. That it was clear that looking at this Catholic archive of friendship, the bonds were sensual, but they they weren't exactly sexual, so that was just kind of a black box. And one friend, but like, for example, it was so passionate, so erotic. Like one friend of the Maritans said in a letter that he wanted to grab Jacques by his lion paws and devour him with his love. Another friend wrote to Raissa Maritain and said that she's so sad that Jacques died that he would never see him again, blowing her kisses and holding hands with him. Another friendship from Cairo that I studied, Louis Massignon, Mary Cahill, they were never, as a man and woman, they weren't a real couple. He was married to another woman, but every year they traveled alone to Cairo and renewed their vow to one another. And another friend of Massignon said to him, I love him to the point where I sometimes feel my soul can no longer contain my affection. My heart hurts, my breathing stops, my throat is tied, my eyes and my whole body starts burning. So the emotional, even the physical sensuality in these friendships, male and male, female and female, male and female, it recalls a line from the writer Roland Barthes. Friendship, he said, the word is too stuffy, it's too prudish. Indeed, we kind of have to ask what was like really going on, underneath all of this excessive ardent desire among friends. Isn't it just a little kind of prudish to say this is all just friendship when, their attachments come across as so sensual, so passionate? So this is the way I kind of have come down on this, but this is the part of my research I'm maybe unsure if I'm right. But on the one hand, I have to admit that their silence on actual sex and their promotion of friendships is part of a long Catholic history of silence about actual sex. The silence about sex here cannot be disentangled from the Catholic silence, which is inextricably connected with the darker issues of, cover-up, shame, lies, deceit, repression around actual physical sex. But on the other hand, does the relative privacy and silence about actual sex mean always just repression or lies or self-loathing or shame, as if to say, while you say you were spiritual friends, no one ever really just wants friendship, right? And it's tempting to turn these people into familiar types like the repressed gay Catholic or the transgressive rebel ahead of her time. But it just doesn't feel quite right. On the one hand, these people were mostly lay people. They were freer than most priests. Their sex lives could and did remain private. Their silence doesn't mean that they felt shameful, repressed, or self-loathing necessarily. And the men and women in these networks didn't come across to me as closeted, as weird about sex, repressed, or self-loathing in any way, sublimating their pent-up sexual desire into these weird and exhausting friendships. Because I think to insist that sex is the only real truth underneath ardent desire among adult friends, I think is to radically narrow this tradition. I think there is an overabundance to spiritual friendship that can't really just be reduced, I don't think, to sex. But I know that's a risk that I'm saying. I don't want to act as if like sexuality is some secret garden elsewhere, but nor is sex, how we think of it, gay or straight, repressed or fulfilled, you're having it or you're not, the best way to think about it. Many were just private, and when it came to their writings and talks of sex, actually, the women and the people of color, like black writers like Claude McKay, were very, very reluctant to disclose their intimate practices publicly. And McKay wrote how he was always annoyed how white people were always trying to hunt for biographical clues about his sex life. He called black sexuality a weird obsession for whites. Maybe they need to see a psychologist about it, he wrote in 1937. And furthermore, many of the women in my project are appearing as thinkers for the first time in intellectual history. They're from Chile, Egypt, Martinique, and to probe the sex lives of these non-Western women feels somewhat invasive and predictable. Also, it's clear in this network of spiritual friends that erotic desire flowed in homosexual directions, heterosexual directions, in trios, pairs, community that included individuals, living, dead, of all genders. And reducing this world to familiar contemporary tropes of Catholic repression disregards the variety of the loving bonds and erotic expressions that were not only readily, and they were admitted as kind of the hot center of their religious lives. And it just can't contain the complexities of this world. So was there sexual repression here? shame maybe around sex? Yes, probably, no doubt there was, right? This was Catholicism, but there was a lot more to it besides just that. And though the queer energy of this community was greater than I ever would have anticipated, there was a mystery to their sexual lives. And I ultimately, kind of adhere with the insight of the theologian Marcella Altus-Reed, who says there's more to sexuality than sex. I never really knew what she meant by that until I spent so much time with these sensual but not exactly sexual friendships. Okay, a couple other final points, and then I'm good on time. Then I'm almost done. Okay. So Catholics, I would say two other final insights. Catholics have always been known to be more communal as opposed to Protestant individualism, a communal kind of faith, which is because Catholics are seen to have commitments to social teaching or the common good, or especially to have affiliations with like a big, massive institutional church. But I saw Catholic corporatism in this community as something more intimate and interpersonal. Today, I think people think that there's two options for Catholics. It's either, the institutional church, or you kind of get away from it all and you have a kind of personal spirituality that's private and individualist. That these people kind of carved out a space for faith that was different. It was neither, the same world as the world of the priests and the bishops, but it wasn't just an individualist, do your own thing either. It was a communal Catholicism different than what we normally imagine. And it was in this communal context of friendship within Catholicism itself that people had the strength to resist all the hatreds associated with modern empires and the pull of secularism. This was an undercurrent that generated Catholicism's most creative and radical turn. And finally, one other point here, and then my conclusion, that although I've emphasized the political nature and the political results of these friendships, when these people wrote about their friends, they always wanted to emphasize the fact that each friendship could not be reduced exactly to the social, the moral, the political. They always seemed to emphasize that each friend inhabited a world that was somehow strange, different, taboo, as if the friend came from elsewhere. In the same way that when we hear, stories about the saints, there's kind of a strangeness and otherness, even something kind of disturbing or impolite about their friends. They always wrote about their friends in that way, as if to say, these friends are holy because they come from an elsewhere. There is something of God that becomes present in the context of these friendships. So they cannot be entirely reduced to political categories, although that's what I've emphasized. And as I conclude, I just want to mention something finally that I said at the outset, that initially when I was a younger scholar, I was too embarrassed to study friendship. It didn't seem critical enough or suspicious enough or academic enough. And had I never just forced myself to get over that embarrassment, I would have missed what I think of as the heartbeat of the most creative period of 20th century global Catholicism. It was the fuel for resistance and enabled the resources to imagine another possible world. It offered transcendence. So my advice to you students, especially it's so wonderful, so many of you are just starting out your time at Holy Cross, my advice to you is as you embark on your own research projects, your final papers, think about senior theses, independent studies, summer research, that will hopefully be just the beginning of an adult life of curiosity and learning. Trust your gut. Listen to your instincts. When your attention is grabbed by something you're reading or discovering, this is important. The odds are that there is something there, something worthy of your care and your exploration. And in the humanities, sometimes I think we're better at critique than affirmation, better at deconstruction than building up. And I learned from this network of friends of how you could dedicate your lives to something that you find worthy of your devotion and care. And I really hope something for each of you students here at Holy Cross. There's so much to learn, so much to uncover that can give us material to think about as we try to envision a better future for ourselves. There's so many relationships waiting for you too when you're in college while you do this work. Relationships with your friends, with your professors, your mentors, and the texts and authors waiting to be explored and for their lives and their loves to be unearthed. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. Absolutely. absolutely. This was very much a neo-medieval movement. You know, all of these people, almost everybody I talked about, had a connection with, mendicant or medieval religious order. They were lay Benedictines, Franciscans, and they all very much were interested in reading medieval theology, spirituality, as a resource to kind of counter where they saw, modernity headed, like a sinking ship, as the wars, they were not optimistic about modernity like sometimes in the United States. And there's a lot that of medieval writers themselves write about friendship, friendship as having partners on the pathway for God, friendships in sort of the homosocial context of monasteries and convents. So Davy wrote a lot about the theologies of friendship in the Cistercians, for example. And so, they were interested, too, in kind of the study of the theology of friendship that comes from monastic contexts. So it was like they kind of took the monastic spirituality of friendship, but wanted to kind of bring it out into the world without the structure of the monastery, where it is like you can have friendships but not special friends. It's just like a lot of surveillance around don't get too close to friends in the monastic context. So it was... of them really feeling their own way, I would say, without the structure of the monastery, but it was a theology of monastic friendship. So it was different, that was one of the things that I learned. I mean, when I started with the Maritans, they had friendships and saw their friends and cultivated and smoothed and sustained friendships in a way that might be familiar to us. They had this big salon, so people talked about almost like a religious pilgrimage going to their house, and they hosted discussion groups, and even their house felt religious. They had permission to have a chapel in their home, so every Sunday people would come to their home, and then afterwards they would intensify that, sending letters and thank you notes. There was just a whole apparatus, I'd say, to friendship. But it was a lot of having people at their homes. But things like, too, they would travel a lot as speakers or as activists, and, they would go through so much effort to meet with friends. It was like Jacques, if he had a conference in Chicago, he would try to get his New York friends to come to Chicago just for a lunch. So I kind of think about that, all of us, we're so busy. I sometimes think if I really want to keep up a close friendship, it takes a lot of work, and they put a lot of work into it, I would say. But then someone like Davy was such a loner that it was kind of all these, in memories and writing about friends and eulogies and thinking about the past. So she wrote a ton of books about her friends, and it was more like mentally, if you think about, you just wrote a book about someone you used to know, that was how it kind of happened. But lots of correspondence, travel, face-to-face meetings, introducing people to one another, Davy, Mistral went to Brazil. Maritain said, I really want you to meet one of my spiritual friends in Brazil you might like. So it was really the organizing structure of their relationality, their intellectual life, their activism, and they put a ton of effort into it. But that's a great question. How important was it? That's a really good question, too, and it really is the subject of a lot of contemporary historiographical debate. So, for example, in France right now, there's a lot of investment of saying, hey, this French resistance among Catholics was the way France really fell. This was what most people did. This was a big deal. But scholars really say this was such a small number of people who engaged in the resistance. It was a minority movement, from start to finish. Now, I would say France could be proud because about 1/4 of the Jewish population in France was deported or died. A quarter of the Jewish population was lost. Now, it would have been less had more people engaged in resistance, but it certainly would have been more had the resistance not happened. I mean, I met that guy, so for that small number, very important, whereas something in the Netherlands, about 3/4 of their Jewish population was killed. So that is a difference. So it's those numbers really do matter, but, and for Catholics too, it's sometimes I get nervous, it's almost like as a Catholic, you want to say, look at what Catholics did during the war. You make almost a bigger deal out of it, whereas I always want to be clear, this was a small number. Most Catholics complied, most Catholics obeyed. That was the mainstream. These we're talking about a numerically small number of incredibly courageous people, Yeah, but I think that's a good question because there's a lot at stake at that. Like, yeah. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for taking time. I appreciate it.